This is Angel Coleman. You have now made it to what is currently the last book of the series. However, please keep your eyes and ears open as the author, Christopher Lee Roeters, originally meant this to be a 10-book series. And once again, welcome to the next book as we continue to show you our family saga.
Prologue. It had been primarily a mild winter as Angel stepped into the Memorial Hospital. Nothingless, the gusts of Arctic winds coming through the Rocky Mountains and then through Craig caused Angel to decide to land on the ground and walk into the warm building. Rather than just sitting in the waiting room, he chose to walk the halls. After walking through a set of double doors, Angel soon found himself peering through a large panel of glass. Staring back at him was 4 infant children. With his discovery, Angel's appetite began to grow as he realized that nobody was looking over the would-be quick meals. Hell! Angel thought to himself, this is better than McDonald's. Peering just beyond the large sheet of glass, Angel found a door with the word nursery placard on it. It was about 6 o'clock in the afternoon of December 28 when Dr. Vigil was about to head home after his shift. Walking through the last hallway of the pediatrics wing, he rounded the corner just in time to see a young boy walk into the nursery room. "Hey!" the doctor called out just a moment too late. Just as he had barely gotten the word out of his mouth, the heavy wooden door latched. "Oh, hi there!" a woman's voice called out just as Dr. Vigil reached the door. Placing his hand on the door handle, he looked back to see a nurse walking towards him. "Well, hello there, Mrs. Peterson," the doctor responded. "How are you doing this evening?" "I'm doing okay. Just before the door latched behind him, Angel suddenly heard the loud voice of an older man out in the hall. Quietly, Angel walked up to one of the 4 clear cribs that stood in front of a large window. Off to one side of the window was a pull string for curtains that hung on the opposite end of the large piece of glass. Quickly, yet quietly, Angel pulled on the strings until the view, from the hallway, was completely obstructed. Then, as he turned around, he found himself to be the center of attention to 4 sets of eyes. Walking back to one particular infant, the one closest to the door, Angel carefully stepped up onto his tiptoes as he reached in to pick up the restless baby as it only stared back at him sucking on its fists. Lifting the infant up and over the edge of the plastic crib, Angel quickly placed one hand behind the baby's back as he simultaneously rested the weight of the child on his left arm. With the baby's head over his own shoulder, Angel then sniffed the infant's skin, within the crook of its neck, as he then immediately opened his jaws wide. Just before Angel closed his canines around the soft tissues, he quickly licked the warm skin, causing the infant to suddenly giggle and jump within his arms. Tilting the baby back, away from his shoulder, he looked at the child's face as he just smiled back. "What are you smiling about?" Angel spoke softly. In response, the bundle of joy kicked its legs and then put its fist back into its mouth. Like this, the baby seemed to just stare back at Angel. "You know." Angel spoke again, "I think that I like you. What's your name?" Stepping back, towards the crib, Angel looked at the name that was printed on the head of the plastic contraption. Coincidentally, the same name that he also found on the child's wrist bracelet. Michael Dale Hall. "Well, Michael, today is your lucky day." Just as the words came out of Angel's mouth, the wooden door suddenly flew open as a man, with blue scrubs, walked in. "Who are you, young man?" the guy asked as he looked down to Angel. "Ah. Michael's big brother." Angel lied. "Well, I'm sorry, but nobody belongs in here," the man said as he then lifted Michael out of Angel's arms. "You can look at your brother through the window." After replacing the infant back inside of his crib, the man then opened the curtains that hid the large window. Choosing to not attract any attention, Angel complied with what the man said and followed him out of the room. Stopping in front of the window, Angel stopped as he observed the guy disappear around a corner. Moments later, Angel then walked back into the room. Immediately closing the curtain again, Angel then went directly back to Michael's side and looked into the crib. Just like moments before, Michael smiled back at Angel just as they made eye contact with one another. Reaching into his front pocket, Angel then pulled out a pocket knife and opened it. "Michael, I won't let this hurt too much," Angel whispered as he then pulled Michael's hand up to the upper edge of the crib. Taking the small hand up in his own, Angel then slashed the soft tissues of the back of Michael's left hand, causing a stream of blood to rise out of the incision. Instantly the smile disappeared off of Michael's face. However, Michael didn't cry as Angel licked the warm fluids off of the child's hand. Then, after taking only one good swipe, with his tongue, of the thick fluids, Angel then held Michael's hand tightly for a moment as he looked around the room. On the opposite side of the door, to the nursery, Angel found what he was looking for. A button with instructions, beside it, to press button for help. Looking back to Michael, Angel then released the child's hand as he then turned to leave. Standing within the doorway, then looking both ways of the hall before stepping out, Angel then quickly pressed that little button and then darted down the hallway. Just seconds later, as Angel reached the end of the hall, he quickly turned to the sound of the nursery door opening again just as two women entered the room. "I wonder which one of you four pressed that button," a woman's voice said loudly. Without further ado, Angel then proceeded out of the hospital, into the cold air, and then headed home. Chapter 1. It was fairly warm for the time of year, almost 40 degrees, and just 2 days short of New Year's. Considering that Karina had managed another Christmas, without her beloved and very much missed husband, she had even found it to be striking odd to herself that she had happily accepted an invitation to the New Year's celebration at the police department. "I can't believe that you guys talked me into this," Karina said as she snuggled herself between her oldest son and Tommy. "There isn't anyone working there anymore that worked prior to my retirement." "We know that, Mom," Malachi said as he laid his arm over his mom's shoulders, "but it should go good considering that Tommy and Nicole are both going with us." Then, pulling his mom close to himself, as her, Tommy and himself all sat in the back seat of Macaulay's and Lovisa's car, he looked towards his wife in the front passenger seat. "Everyone at the PD knows them. Or at least Tommy anyhow." "Well," Macaulay spoke up as he looked up at the rear-view mirror. Instantaneously, as his eyes could be seen in the reflective glass, the bright light, from the other half of the family tailgating them, illuminated the 19-year-old's face. "You'll know all of them soon, Grandma. Here we are." To ensure that everyone would be able to enjoy the New Year's celebration, the police department had regularly planned their celebration a day or two ahead of schedule. This routine was intended to ensure that perhaps the celebration wouldn't be interrupted by the police department having to respond to callers saying that their own celebrations had gotten out of hand. Also, just by coincidence, this particular day was also the retirement of one of the other officers. "This ought to be quite a celebration," Karina commented as the car came to a stop. Then, with the end of her sentence, Malachi simultaneously opened his door, causing instant relief to the feeling of being a sardine in a can. Then, as she stepped out, right after Malachi, she found that she had just missed stepping into an ankle-deep puddle and then almost into the path of Bobby John's and Dawn D's truck as she cleared herself from the small lake that covered half of the parking lot. "Are you all right, Grandma?" Dawn D asked as she jumped out of the truck. From her point of view, it had looked as though her grandmother had almost fallen. "Yeah, I'm all right, honey," Karina responded. "Just wish that I had known ahead of time that I would need a bathing suit to attend this party." Once on the sidewalk, that turned into steps that led into the basement level of the building, Karina waited for Tommy to catch up so that he could lead the way into the police department. Then, as they proceeded, it was obvious, to Karina, that not a whole lot had changed within the layout of the police department, as they all came to a stop, at the bottom of the stairs, as Tommy pushed a button that quickly gained the attention of the dispatcher through a few different panels of glass. Moments later a mechanical popping sound could be heard as Tom pushed the door open. As the rest of the family filed in behind Tommy and Karina, everyone turned to the right, down a hallway that led into a large room, of which had 2 tables, end to end, producing a large table. Off to the left, just as they entered the large room, was an office that was crowded with off-duty and on-duty officers, staff, and family members to those present. Instantly, Tommy, Karina, Malachi, Nicole, Macaulay, Dawn D, Ronnie, Belinda, Lucifer, Lovisa, and Eddie all stopped and stared into the office as the loud chores of everyone singing their congratulations to the retiring officer roared through the building. Angel lingered behind everyone else as they came into the downstairs level of the building. As everyone had walked down the hallway, towards the large open room, Angel's eyes had turned towards two jail holding cells off of the right side of the hall. In one of the two cells, a man had stood up, facing the window, that separated himself from Angel, and seemed to have been staring directly at him. "That's all right." Jumping directly off of the ground, as a man's voice suddenly bellowed out from behind him and simultaneously grasping his shoulder, Angel had completed a full roundhouse kick, mid-air, as he came just within inches from Chief Chuck Kibbe's nose. "Wah! Slow down there, little one," Chuck said loudly as he instantly jumped backwards. With the sudden noise, that was much louder than the celebration from the office up ahead, the rest of the DeClue Southern family was now staring at Angel and Chuck. Looking down at Angel, the kid had landed on the floor, facing him, in a karate-style stance looking like that he was guarding his very life. "As I was saying," Chuck said, now in a soft voice, "that window is a one-way glass. That man in there can't see you." "Oh," Angel said quietly as he had instantly looked to have relaxed. "In that case I'm sorry for scaring you." With the end of Angel's sentence, he then reached out, with his left hand, to shake the older man's hand. "My name is Angel. I'm here with my family." Moments later the two of them joined everyone else. "Hey guys." Tom spoke up as everyone peered into the very small and well-crowded office. "We're here." Instantly everyone's attention was now on them as the newly retiring officer stood up from the desk. "Hey Officer Russell," the man said over the volume of everyone within the room. "Come on." As Tommy's coworker continued to speak, Karina suddenly froze as she stared at the man in shock. Instantaneously Ronnie and Malachi both seemed to have slightly lost balance as they reached out for physical support. Simultaneously Malachi had also grasped onto the side of his own head as both of the two suddenly received snapshot images of the man staring back at them. Just seconds later, Macaulay and Lucifer had also began to experience the identical chemical imbalance as well. Then, as Tommy turned to look back at his family, in response to a wave of physical tension around him, snapshot images began to clutter his mind as well of his well-known co-worker, Tony Plowman. "What's happening, guys?" Nicole gasped. "That's the..." As Karina spoke, just over that of a whisper, she began to point towards Officer Plowman, guy that had gotten angry at me at the Come and Go gas station on Ronnie's 19th birthday. Just as the words left her mouth, Nicole lowered her mother-in-law's hand before any problems had a chance to spark from the sudden revelation. "You guys alright?" Officer Plowman asked loudly as he stepped forward out of the small crowd. Nobody had heard what Karina had said, except for her family, that is. Then the rest of the department had also taken notice to the very dazed audience. "They'll be just fine." Nicole spoke up for everyone. "We just..." "Well, Officer DeClue," Tony piped up again. As he spoke he then approached Nicole with his hand held out towards her. "It's been a while since I've seen you." With his words, and movement towards Nicole, Malachi suddenly threw up his arm to guard his wife from the clearly obvious danger. Simultaneously Lucifer stood forward, towards Tony as Mr. Plowman had then paused to Malachi's gesture. "Guys," Nicole said quietly. "It's okay. Just relax." Then, as Nicole reached forward, between her husband and son, she shook Officer Plowman's hand. "I'm sorry if I've startled you guys," Tony said as he made eye contact with both Lucifer and Malachi. "It's just that Nicole was a good officer and I enjoyed working with her." With his words, Tony seemed to have seen the sudden fear melt all the way right before his eyes. "It was nice working with you too," Nicole acknowledged. Even with the gentle words, tension was still obviously strong within the small crowd as Lucifer and his father stared at one another. "Well guys," Chuck Kibbe interrupted, "let's have some excitement here. This is Tony's last day and it's almost 2043. As he spoke his words, he seemed to have also seen a light come on within Karina's face. "Now that's more like it," the older man said. With the end of his sentence, Chuck then reached out and patted Karina on the shoulder. "Nice to see you here." "Thank you," Karina responded as she then watched her children and grandchildren greet some of the other guests. "I just realized that it's been almost 26 years since I retired from this department." This revelation was true, however, it was also her intention to dissolve some of the tension within the room. As she watched, out of the corner of her eye, Angel was climbing up onto Tommy's back, off of a chair, as Tom had also partially knelt down to make it easier for him. "Careful, Angel," she thought clearly as she watched the 34-year-old's right foot snag onto Tommy's off-duty service weapon. "We don't want any accidents." In response to Corina's ESP message, Angel then sloped his upper body down to the right, towards Tom's waist, to ensure that he hadn't unsnapped the leather holster. Simultaneously Tommy, himself, had quickly checked the snap, by hand, without even breaking his attention to Ronnie, of whom had began to speak quietly into Tom's ear. "I'm just gonna watch this guy very carefully," Ron whispered as he watched Officer Plowman out of the corner of his eye. "What's going on?" Tom asked quietly. "This guy had gotten loud and threatened my mom years ago, at the gas station." The incident had began a large number of images being stuffed into Malachi's and I's mind that had scared us. Later it turned out to be the fear that our mom was experiencing. Now, 20 years later, we just experienced it all over again as my mom's eyes set themselves on him. Instinctively, Lucifer and Macaulay then felt and saw those same images as Malachi and I just did. "That's never happened to me before," Tom responded as he then whispered back to Ron. "Well, the first time that something comes along that scares Lucifer, you too will experience it. And vice versa. If something happens to you that frightens you, Lucifer will see, for that moment, through your eyes. It's in our blood, Tommy." Throughout the remainder of that evening, everyone enjoyed chips, cookies, and refreshments as everyone intermingled and got to know each other. It was an unusually hot summer as Mr. and Mrs. William Hall headed west on Interstate 80. Leaving their home of Michigan was something that Tina had thought would never happen. Yet, as an employee for API Insulation, of St. Paul, Minnesota, of which involved long stays away from home, Bill had decided that a permanent move to Colorado, of which would place him at a more than less midway point to other work sites, would give him more time at home with his wife. Through a lot of deliberation with Tina, who didn't want to move away from her family, they both came up with an agreement that involved summer vacations to Mansalona, Michigan. "So, are we gonna turn off onto Interstate 70? Tina asked as they had tossed the idea of going through Denver back and forth. "I don't know," William responded as he looked over to his beautiful wife from behind the wheel. Then, after setting his right hand over her shoulder, he looked at her again after checking the traffic in front of him. "If the traffic, that we see now, is any forewarning of what is to come, I think that we're better off staying on 80 up through Wyoming, and then head south through Baggs. That road leads directly into Craig, Colorado." As they had left Mansalona early that morning, they had agreed, ahead of time, that they would only drive up to 8 hours at a time before pulling over for the night. Choosing the straighter route, of which meant staying on Interstate 80, this would cause them to have to continue on past Interstate 70 shortly after passing Chicago. This choice would mean less traffic would take perhaps about the same amount of time. Not only would Interstate 70 force them to go through Denver, it would also cause them to have to drive over the mountains, through the Eisenhower Tunnel, then have to cut onto Interstate 40 of which led into Craig. As a registered nurse, Tina had made phone calls to Craig's the Memorial Hospital. Throughout the last month or so, Tina had filed a resume by internet with the hospital and then, by mere coincidence, had received a telephone response to the resume, just 2 days prior, requesting an interview with Tina on the 6th of July. Their plans to arrive in Craig on the 4th of July appeared to be great timing. "If we get ourselves settled and fast enough, Bill, we might be able to watch the fireworks on our first night." At the Moffat County Fairgrounds, Bill cut in, "I'm one step ahead of you, hun." With his response, William turned his head, to face his wife, and then stuck his tongue out at her. Bill had personally wished for the day that he would be in more of a central location with his job. He loves his wife and hates the long stays away from home. The only downfall to the move to Colorado is that when he is gone, Tina wouldn't have her family nearby for support. And then, of course, the phone bills. For both, Tina and Bill, most of the things between them were in common. Of course, this was the reason that they had finally come to the idea of getting married. Prior to their marriage they had even come to an agreement of how many children that they wanted. 4 or 5. In the end, Bill had decided that he wanted at least one daughter and at least one son. If this meant a dozen boys prior to the birth of a daughter, or vice versa, that's exactly what would happen. His wife agreed. It was on Bill's and Tina's second day on the road, about midway through the day, that they had come across a national memorial that they had decided that they just had to see. Mount Rushmore on the western side of South Dakota. At the memorial there was a movie about the area, and then, of course, you got to see the faces of President Washington, President Jefferson, President Lincoln, and then President Theodore Roosevelt, that are carved into the side of the Black Hills. After the extended stay there at Mount Rushmore, Tina and Bill had decided to drive only a little further, over the Wyoming state border, then find a hotel for the night. Though they hadn't really driven that much, they decided that they would reward themselves for the distance that they had made the previous day. You know, Tina shouted from their motel restroom that evening, if we leave about 10 in the morning, we'll arrive in Craig at about time to eat dinner. And then watch the fireworks after we settle in. William added as he laid down on the bed with the motel room's television remote control. Hey Lucifer. Throw it to me, Angel said as he quickly darted down the length of the driveway. It was only once in a great while that the gas would play basketball. Especially on the 4th of July. With luck, this Independence Day was starting out with an overcast. As the holiday brewed, everyone decided to turn their backs on their nocturnal life for one day with the hopes of doing their family day either at the city park pool, or the high school's pool. Here Angel, Lucifer said as he jumped high enough to pass the ball over Macaulay's head. Then, at the peak of his jump, he held the rubber ball within both hands and shot it about 15 feet over Angel's head. Ops. Sorry Angel. Then, as the words were still coming out of Lucifer's mouth, Angel flew up, 20 feet into the air, as he caught the ball and then placed it into the net. Instantly, Macaulay, Lucifer, Tommy, and Bobby John all quickly began to look into the yards and windows of their neighbors in hopes that nobody had witnessed the catch. Only witnesses, however, was Eddie as he then immediately exited the back door of the basement. Angel, come here please. Eddie requested as he came out into the driveway. Eddie didn't appear to be angry, yet he was obviously concerned about the use of powers in plain daylight. Then, as Angel was standing beside his roommate, looking up to him, Eddie placed his hand on Angel's shoulder. Hey buddy, listen, Ed whispered, we really must be very careful doing anything outside during the daytime. Someone could have seen you do that. I know, Angel said as he looked down to his own feet. I just forgot. I'm sorry Eddie, Angel said as he looked back to him. I know you didn't mean it, Eddie continued as he ruffled Angel's hair within his fingers. Just be more careful buddy. Hey Eddie, Tommy said as he approached the two as they spoke alone. Would you please take this into the house for me? Pulling his hand out from behind him, Tommy brought forth his service weapon within its holster. Lucifer and I have our stuff in Macaulay's car for swimming. I don't plan to head back in any time soon. Yeah. I can do that. How about you guys lock up the garage so that we can head over to pick up Karina and Marie in a few minutes. In mid-sentence, just as Eddie had secured the weapon within his armpit, all of the boys' attention was brought to the driveway next door to the Alberts' residence where a blue minivan pulled in. Who's that? Macaulay thought out loud. About a month prior, the former residents of that house, the Bowers, had moved to Arizona. The Alberts had said something in regards to a newly married couple, from Michigan, were about to move in, yet had made it sound as though it would be much later in the summer before that would happen. Don't know. Eddie answered Macaulay. Then, looking back to Tommy, Eddie repeated himself. Go ahead and lock up the garage. I'll take your gun in and hurry the girls up. With that said, Eddie looked back towards the blue minivan again. And then turned to head into the house. Here Angel. Tom called as he walked towards the open garage door. I'll put the ball away. Just as requested, Angel then bounced the ball towards Tommy who, in turn, shot the ball towards the hoop. That was just luck, Angel said as he watched the ball exiting the net. With his words, he then smirked at Tommy with a slight smile that grew as Tom looked back at Angel with his tongue stuck out. No. Luck is what it would have been called if you had gotten it in one shot. Well, good Bill. We have at least one child for a neighbor. Tina announced as she looked across the street as a kid had bounced a ball towards an adult. Looks like a Hispanic family. Yeah. Just keep in mind honey that isn't our child. We'll have our own soon enough, Bill joked as he stood on the front porch with his wife. Standing there, Bill searched his pocket for the key that the realtor had mailed them. Moments later they were both walking into their new home. Entering into the dining room with the kitchen to the immediate left, both Bill and Tina walked forward into the living room that had a sliding glass door that led to the backyard. Facing the same direction, to the immediate right, and behind them, there was a set of stairs leading upward. "Well, this looks nice," Bill said as he turned to see his wife smiling back at him. "Now all that we have to do is wait for our moving truck to show up." "And when is that?" Tina asked as she continued to smile at her husband. Looking at his watch. As he simultaneously pressed a button on its side, he then looked back up to her. "On the 9th. Almost instantly. Tina's smile faded away. Just 2 weeks later, on the 19th of July, Don D and Bobby John were preparing for bed. It was still early in the day, about 2 o'clock, almost time for bed, when Don D was suddenly crippled by a sudden feel of pain within her abdomen. "Don D!" Bunin yelled just as he was about to lay down. Instantly Bobby John flew off of the bed and then to her side as she laid near the bedroom door. 0 hours Bobby, Don D cried, "What's happening to me?" As the two of them remained on the floor, with Bobby John kneeling over her, he held her tightly as they both felt a weird tightening sensation in her stomach. "I don't know," Bobby John answered. "Macaulay, Lucifer, and Tommy. Help. Something's wrong with..." Before the whole thought had left his mind, Bobby John had suddenly heard doors slamming from both across the hall, and then downstairs. Then, without even completing his thought, Macaulay was opening their bedroom door and then getting down, onto his knees on the opposite side of Don D. "What's wrong, Don D?" Macaulay asked his sister loudly. What he saw was his sister laying down on her left side, sweating, and crying as her and Bobby John both held onto her belly. "Dad." Macaulay thought clearly, something is wrong with Don D. "Help us." As Macaulay remained at her side, his shadow, that was casted onto the floor beyond his sister and Bobby John, suddenly disappeared as the source of light, from the hallway, suddenly was blocked. "What's going on?" Lucifer and Tommy both simultaneously shouted from the doorway. "I don't know," Bobby John said as he too began to lightly cry. She just doubled over and cried in pain. "I don't know what's wrong." As he spoke, Bobby John leaned forward, over Don D, as he attempted to ease her pain. Then, just as Tommy turned on the bedroom light, the sound of the kitchen's sliding glass door could be heard opening as Ronnie's voice could then also be heard through the house. "Dad," Macaulay yelled, in Don D's room. About 2:30 in the morning, Ronnie, with his daughter in his arms, Bobby John, Tommy, Lucifer, and Macaulay all landed within the shadows, along the north side of the hospital, and then walked into the emergency door entrance. Greeting them, as they entered the waiting room, a nurse came right up to them. "How may I help you guys?" "Ma'am," Bobby John managed, "something is wrong with my wife." As Bobby spoke, he held onto Don D's hand. She just collapsed at home." "Just relax, sir," the nurse said as she too reached out to touch Don D's hand, "and follow me." Then, after following the nurse through only one length of hall, they soon entered the emergency room where Ronnie then laid his daughter onto a padded gurney. Then, just seconds later, she handed Bobby John a clipboard with an attached pen. "Please fill this out as much as you can. The doctor will be here soon." Then, with the end of her sentence, she immediately turned her attention towards Don D. "Okay, ma'am. Where are you hurting the most?" Though Don D was holding her lower abdomen with both hands, she made no hesitation to answer the women's question. "My tummy." Holding her breath for a moment, so that she could continue to speak, through waves of pain, she then continued, "My belly really hurts." And then, sobbing, "It'll stop and then begin again." As the nurse listened, she could see Don D's belly tighten. Then, seemingly noticeable to everyone all at once, Dr. Scott Kennedy walked into the room looking like he had just got out of bed. Immediately the nurse approached him, got up onto her tiptoes, and then whispered into the man's ear. "Well, hello, Mr. DeClue," the doctor said as he then looked towards Ronnie. Within the short moment of whispering, There wasn't any visual sign of the doctor responding back to the nurse. Instead, he abruptly walked away from the nurse as he walked right up to Don D's side. Immediately, without explanation, the doctor took his stethoscope out of his pocket, and then placed it onto the warm skin just below Don D's belly button. Seconds later, without skipping a beat, Dr. Kennedy then pulled his stethoscope out of his ears as he then took a visual look at Don D's stomach. Using his hands, he then appeared to the rest of the family, to be measuring the small body frame of Don D's hips. "Well, I'd be. Hey guys," Scott said as he then turned and took a hold of a curtain beside the gurney, "I'm gonna close this real quick. I need to examine her better." "Can my husband stay please?" Don D asked between tears. "Well yes. Of course he can," the doctor answered as he simultaneously pulled the curtain completely around them. "Now, Don D, I need you to remove your clothes and place this apron on." As he spoke, he pulled out a blue scrub-colored apron and handed it to Bobby John. "I'll be right back." Instantly, the doctor then turned and walked out. As his footsteps faded off into the distance, both Bobby John and Don D turned and looked at each other. At eye contact, Bobby handed the apron to her. "Hello," Belinda said as she answered the phone. She had been expecting the call after Ron had been abruptly requested to an emergency involving their only daughter. "Hey Mom. This is Macaulay." "Oh hi son. What's happening?" Both Belinda and Ronnie had planned to watch MASH on television that night. It had been almost 75 years since the first airing of the sitcom. Marie had spoken of MASH like as if had only been yesterday. "We don't know yet. Dr. Kennedy is doing an exam right." "Well Macaulay. Tell me what happened at home." I don't really know Mom," Macaulay said as he quickly tried to answer her question. Being that she was obviously their mom, Macaulay knew well that their mom must be scared. He remembered an incident, back when he was in high school, to where he had fainted outside of the school building. His parents were scared to death when they had learned that he had been picked up by the local ambulance. "All that I know is that I woke up suddenly from an ESB message from Bobby John. He said that something was wrong with Don D. When I went into there." "Okay Don D," the doctor said as he entered the room. Just as he asked, Don D had gotten herself into the light blue-colored scrubs. "I need you to please prop your feet into these stirrups." Looking at Dr. Kennedy, as he pointed at 2 footrests just under the edge of the gurney, she quickly followed his direction as he simultaneously sat on a stool between her legs after a female nurse covered Belinda's legs with a sheet. Like this, with her knees bent, the sheet formed a tent. "Oh my God," the doctor mumbled quietly. "What?" Bobby John blurted out immediately. "Hey Tina. Come here," the doctor said to the nurse. Moments later, while both the nurse and Dr. Kennedy peered into the tent, both of their jaws seemed to drop. "Mr. and Mrs. Southern. I hope that you're prepared for this. And I'm just as." "Dr. Kennedy." Don D now persisted, "What is it?" "You are." Pausing, as he then stood up from the seat. "You're not only very pregnant. You're also about to deliver." But doctor," Bobby John stuttered. "How can that?" "I'm pregnant?" Don D screeched loudly. She's pregnant?" As the words came out of Bobby John's mouth, the words had come out to just over the volume of a whisper as he then quickly took a seat, almost falling into the padded wheeled chair. "And, like I said," the doctor continued, "you're gonna deliver any minute now. The fact is that Don D didn't even look pregnant, much less pregnant enough to give birth. Her waist size, of which hadn't gained more than enough to pass for bloating, that is, was only about 36 inches. As for her breast, of which also didn't look out of normal size, they were naturally large since her freshman year." Both Bobby John and Don D were instantly in shock as they just stared at the faces of both Dr. Kennedy and the nurse. "You're feeling labor pains, Mrs. Southern," the nurse said as the young couple just continued to stare back at them. "I'm gonna move you to the delivery room. How about you go ahead and put your legs back down?" Without words, Don D responded promptly as she also held onto her husband's hand. Seconds later, without even having to sit up or stand up, the gurney began to move out of the exit door to the emergency room. "Honey," Dondi said as she still held on tightly to Bobby's hand. How about you go and tell my dad what's up so that he won't worry anymore? Alright. Just hold on a minute, Bobby John said, and then carefully let go of her hand. At first, rather than turning back towards the waiting room, Bobby just stood there and watched the gurney roll away from him. I'm about to be a father? It was getting to be about 3:20 in the morning as Ronnie had began to worry a lot. Nobody was letting him know what was happening to his daughter. Macaulay had attempted to find out what was up by walking back into the emergency room. Moments later, however, he walked back out to the waiting room saying that Dondi nor Bobby John were even in there. Then, just as he decided that he was gonna find out, one way or another, he stood up just on time to find his son-in-law coming around the corner. What's happening? Ron gasped as he made eye contact with Bobby. John. You wouldn't believe me if I told you, Bobby said as he walked right up to Ron. Looking a little flushed in the face, Bobby John paused a moment before he continued with his explanation. What do you mean, Bobby? Ron asked with an odd look on his face. With the question, Macaulay then stood up also as he placed a gentle hand on Bobby John's shoulder. Dondi. Pausing as he looked back up to Ronnie's eyes, Dondi is pregnant. And she's about to give birth right now. As the words came out of his mouth, Bobby John almost wanted to cringe at himself for what he was saying. As his father-in-law and brother-in-law only stared back, shock could be seen on their faces as he simultaneously felt the tension through the fingertips of Macaulay's hand across the bridge of his right shoulder. Pregnant? Ronnie asked as past images of his own wife, during pregnancy, went through his mind. How could she be pregnant? Macaulay finished for his father. Macaulay had only seen his sister just before they had stepped into their bedroom. He couldn't even imagine 9 months' worth of pregnancy taking place all in 2 hours. She can't be pregnant. That would be. I know what you're saying, Macaulay, Bobby John said as he looked to his left, but right now, the doctor is saying that she is full term. Turning his head back towards Ron, he continued. I'm gonna head back in there. I'll keep you guys up to date. Then, just as abruptly as he had come out to the waiting room, he then turned and walked away. It had seemed that Bobby John had been gone a long time before he had suddenly walked back into the delivery room. Yet they had both decided that her father should know what was happening. Now, as Bobby John, once again, redressed into scrubs, he then quickly raced to his wife's side. Honey, Dondi said as she looked up to her husband. It hurts so much. Pausing as she let go of the bed rail and then took Bobby's hand. Please stop it from hurting. Hey Dondi. The female nurse said as she walked into the room right behind Bobby John, we're gonna take care of the pain right now, honey, just hold on. Then, no longer than it had taken for her to say so, she was quickly injecting morphine into an IV that was hooked up to Dondi's right hand. It seemed that the morphine had taken its toll on Dondi instantly. She had just pled to her husband to stop the pain, was interrupted by the nurse, and then, before she could even refocus her eyes on Bobby John, she was suddenly feeling no pain at all as she then simultaneously was lost for words as she held her mouth open to Bobby. It's alright Dondi, Bobby John said as her look of agony turned into that of extremely high. Okay Dondi. Dr. Kennedy said as he was once again positioned between her legs, when I say to, I want you to push as hard as you can. Alright? Alright. Bobby's wife responded with a huge smile on her face. I'll push as hard as I can. Ah. Tina. The doctor said quietly as he motioned for the nurse to come to his side. How much morphine did you give her? Before the nurse had a chance to respond, the doctor then suddenly felt Dondi's abdomen tighten up again. Alright Dondi. Pausing as he quickly regained eye contact again, push hard. Well Dad. What do you want me to tell Mom? Macaulay asked his dad as he was just sitting back down. Ronnie hadn't really said anything since Bobby John had walked away. His face was clouded with a look of confusion as too much information was coming in all at one time. Looking back at his son, Ronnie stared at the 20-year-old for a moment before answering. Nothing. I'll call her this time. With that said, Ronnie then pulled his cell phone out of his front pocket. Of everything that was happening, the biggest thing that weighed on Ron's mind is how he was quickly turning into a grandfather. It was also now that the obvious differences between himself and Malachi and their father were now shining brightly. With vampires, and Ronnie knew it well, males stop visually aging at the age of 21 while females, on the other hand, continue to age but at only half the rate as normal humans. After a female turns 21, she will, along with males, count her yearly birthdays, however they do visually age, but only at half the rate of humans. This means the female vampires die at the age of about 200 while their male loved ones, as long as they harvest, continue to live throughout eternity looking each and every day to not be a day over 21. To make a long story short, it would appear, to others, that a 21-year-old was about to become a grandfather. "Hello," Belinda answered after she had seen Ronnie's cell phone number on the caller ID. Moments prior, seemingly only 10 minutes ago, she had spoken to her son. "Hello honey," Ronnie responded, "are you sitting down by any chance?" "Ah. Should I be?" Belinda counter-questioned. "Yeah. I think that you just might wanna sit down for this one," Ron said as he simultaneously began to cover his mouth with his free hand. "Oh my God honey. What's wrong?" Belinda began to worry now as her husband's words began to set in. "Nothing bad Belinda." Ron shot out quickly, "Something good. Something also very surprisingly though." "Okay honey. Please tell me." "Belinda. You and I are about to become grandparents," Ron said point blank. Instantly, Ron felt as though he had accidentally disconnected the call as the silence on the other end became even more silent as he could no longer hear his wife's breathing. "Honey. Are you still there?" "Yeah. Grandparents?" Belinda said, in now a very quiet voice. "Grandparents. It's true honey," Ron continued as he fought to fight back emotions. Shortly after going to the hospital, making sure that Don D made it okay, both Lucifer and Tommy went back to the house. As it neared 4 o'clock in the morning, they had dared themselves to wake up Eddie and Angel to alert them to what was happening, but chose, instead, to just allow them to sleep. Otherwise it would be 2 other people, awake and needlessly worrying. "Uncle Ronnie." Lucifer thought clearly, "What's happening?" "Your little cousin, Don D, is about to become a mother." Ronnie responded immediately. Then, standing up abruptly, he then quickly turned to look at his son. "Macaulay. I'll be right back." As Ronnie headed out of the waiting room, into the direction that Bobby John had disappeared into, he continued his thought to Lucifer. "Lucifer, we'll let you know when we get out of here." "Okay buddy." "Okay Uncle Ronnie." Lucifer answered. Reaching over to Tommy, as he sat close to him, on their mattress, he lightly hugged the 24-year-old as he then also whispered into his ear. "Tommy. My uncle says that Don D is giving birth." Turning, to look at Lucifer, Tommy's face had an odd look of question. "She wasn't pregnant. Was she?" Waiting for a response, Tom continued to stare back at him. "Well. I didn't think that she was." "I don't know," Lucifer said as now the look on his face began to look serious. We've got to move Tom," Lucifer said as he realized the impact that a baby would have on the household. Both Lucifer and Tommy worked third-shift jobs. Tommy at the Craig Police Department and then Lucifer at the Hayden Station Power Plant. Eddie and Angel both stayed at home, taking care of the house. Bobby John was an auto mechanic also in the process of getting his own business license for auto repair. Don D stayed at home, Lovisa worked for a taxidermist, on the other side of town, and Macaulay also stayed at home. "Yeah. We do," Tom agreed quietly. This wasn't a moment that either Tom or Lucifer were looking forward to. They enjoyed their life in the house that they had both grown up in. Leaning towards Lucifer, Tommy then lightly pecked him on the lobe of the ear. "Don D's turn is here finally," Lloyd said as he got up off of the floor beside Tom's and Lucifer's feet. Looking back down, towards James and Scott, whom continued to also watch television, Lloyd continued. "And I think that Lucifer is right. It is time for them to move out on their own." But we won't see them very often. Scott protested the idea. Yeah, we will. James interrupted as he looked at Scott. James had successfully untied both Lucifer's and Tommy's shoes without either one of them knowing about it. We still see Ronnie and Malachi, don't we? Yeah, but that's different. How's that different? Lloyd answered for James. No matter where these guys live, they will always stop here because this is where they grew up. This is the only place that they can see us. Also, they will still have their family days, of which some take place here. This move will be good for Tommy and Lucifer guys. I think that we should congratulate them for their choice. Just as Lloyd finished his sentence, he looked down to see James about to tie all 4 shoestrings together. Let's not hurt them. Instantly, James just let the strings fall to the floor. Yeah. You're right. Scott said as he then stood up. It's just gonna be odd with them gone. Then as Scott turned his attention back to the television, he rested his hand on Tom's knee, causing a fold, within the jeans, to flatten against Tommy's leg. Immediately, in response, Tom then held his hand, about an inch off of the surface of his knee, where he then felt the coolness of one of their friend's hands. Okay, Macaulay. The nurse said as she looked up at him from next to the doctor, the baby is gonna be here any minute now. Come over here and then you can cut the umbilical cord. Alright? The last thing that Macaulay had planned on before heading to bed a few hours prior, was becoming a father before he would actually get to sleep. Now cutting an umbilical cord. The only example of dealing with any children that Macaulay could relate to was his personal interactions with Lloyd, James, and Scott. Then, at that, there was no real physical interaction. Nothingless, Macaulay did as he was instructed and left the refuge of Dondee's death grip that seemed to be squeezing every last drop of blood out of his hand. As he walked to the foot end of the gurney, his wife's slight crying had began to sound like a growl. Okay, Macaulay. Dr. Kennedy spoke up, I want you to stand here. As the doctor continued to talk to Macaulay, Dondee fought back the urge to cry as the morphine quickly wore off with each contraction. Then, just out of the corner of her eye, she saw the delivery room door open slightly as her father's head popped in. Am I too late? Ronnie asked just as he stepped all the way in. Just before walking into the room, Ron was instructed to put on a pair of scrubs for the safety of the unborn baby. Now, as he walked up to his daughter's side, he sensed a flow of peace between himself and Dondee that he hadn't felt in years. In what was like a symbolic answer to his question, the baby then simultaneously found its way out into its own father's hands as its vocal cords echoed off of the walls, instantly sending chills down Ronnie's back. It's a boy, Bobby John said loudly. Then, with a lot of excitement flowing through him, Bobby quickly grabbed up a couple plastic clips for putting on the umbilical cord and then began to put them on, and then grabbed the scissors. Bobby John. The doctor screeched loudly. That's not the umbilical cord. He needs that thing. As he spoke loudly, Dr. Kennedy had also blocked Bobby's hand from being able to make contact with what would have been a large mistake. We'll cut the excess skin off of that later. Here's what you need to cut. About instantly, Bobby John was in shock of himself due to the near mistake that he had made. With the loud volume from the doctor, Bobby John had also found that everyone within the room had their eyes set on him, including a newborn whom was no longer crying. Now, with everyone's attention on him, he slowly replaced the clips to where they belonged, tightened them, and then carefully cut the cord between the 2 clips. With the snip, the baby, once again, began to cry very loudly. Moments later, the female nurse stood up and walked away with the infant. Watching her child be carried to a nearby sink, where he was quickly bathed, Dondee had felt as though she was instantly ready to be a mom for the first time in her life. From her father's point of view, it had looked like that his daughter had found a second love. With it, joy was quickly replaced the confusion that had overwhelmed the last couple of hours. Just moments later, the sleeping infant, wrapped up in a blanket, was being set on Dondee's chest. What should we name him? Bobby John asked as he stood on the opposite side of his wife from his father-in-law. I don't know, Dondee said as she lightly rubbed the tip of the baby's nose. Let's make it Hispanic though, Dondee said as she looked back at her husband for approval. How about Elian Gonzalez Southern? Ronnie had jokingly spoke up. Instantaneously both Bobby John and Don D looked back to him. "That was a joke," Ron said quickly. "You guys can." "No, Dad." Don D interrupted, "That sounded perfect." Then, as Don D quickly looked back up towards Bobby John, she saw an instant look of approval. "Elian Gonzalez Southern it is then," Bobby said as he nodded his head towards his son.